International news now.
All right, so we're going to move on to our next news story in an emergent conflict between two American allies in the fight against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, the Kurds and the Iraqi central government. We will discuss some of the fighting that has erupted in the contested area of Kirkuk in northern Iraq. This region is adjacent to, but not part of, the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Now, the Kurdish region of Iraq has been operating for years as a semi-autonomous region within Iraq. In 2014, when ISIS emerged over the summer of 2014, Iraqi government military forces retreated in the face of the spread of ISIS in this region. After this initial retreat, Kurdish forces retook this territory from ISIS, including the key region of the city and surrounding region of Kirkuk, which is the main oil-producing region of Iraq, and thus a key part of Iraq. Since 2014, Kurdish forces have administered the Kirkuk region. Now, it must be noted that the U.S. has supported, with airstrikes and eventually weapons, both the military of the Iraqi central government and the Kurdish forces, which are known as the Peshmerga, in the larger battle against ISIS. The Kurdish Peshmerga forces have been some of the most effective local fighters against ISIS in the region, and thus have become an important ally of the United States. Now, when the common enemy of ISIS dominated regional politics, there was a tense but functional alliance between the United States, the Kurds, and the Iraqi government as they worked together to fight this common foe, ISIS. However, there was always a lingering potential future conflict if and when that common foe of ISIS was defeated, a conflict over who would control the settlement that came afterwards in the region, and we're at that point now. Now, this future conflict revolves around the larger question about the future of Iraq as a state. Kurds have long desired autonomy or an independent state of their own. 3 weeks ago, they acted on this desire by holding a referendum on independence against the advice and preferences of the Iraqi central government, which said that such a referendum would be illegal, as well as by the United States. The U.S. opposed this as well, warning the Kurds that a referendum could spark ethnic violence between the Kurds and Arab Iraqis. Now, this referendum was sanctioned by the Kurdish regional government. Much like the referendum in Catalonia, the prospect of independence movements challenging state sovereignty was viewed as destabilizing for the whole region, and as we will see, resisted by other important international actors like Iran and Turkey, who feared independence movements would get a new push among their own Kurdish minority populations. Now, this referendum held 3 weeks ago was thus the precipitating event for military conflict that has broke out in the past week. So we're going to watch a clip now from PBS NewsHour that summarizes these developments, and then we'll discuss some of those main dynamics. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
Long-standing rivalries were reignited in Iraq today between vital American allies. Iraqi military forces and militia moved to push Kurdish forces out of the disputed city of Kirkuk in the country's north. Lisa Desjardins has our report.
The commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Dr. Haider al-Abadi, gave orders to protect the people of Kirkuk and to impose security in the city.
After months of simmering tensions, Iraqi federal troops moved to retake the disputed city of Kirkuk from Kurdish forces. The effort launched before dawn. By midday, Iraqi soldiers, along with state-backed militias, quickly took control of several massive oil fields north of the city. Iraqis also captured Kirkuk Military Airport and various government buildings. They lowered what had been a symbolic Kurdish flag at the governor's compound. Journalist Rebecca Collard in Erbil was in Kirkuk this morning.
You could hear some clashes, some gunfire in the distance, but for the most part, the city seemed more or less abandoned. Now, the Iraqi army by the end of today was essentially in control of the whole city and many of the outskirts of Kirkuk.
The spokesman for an Iraqi Shiite militia said they achieved all their goals with little resistance.
As the troops approached the area, they were confronted by some rebels who tried to hinder the progress of the advancing units. Our troops returned fire and silenced its source.
This comes 3 weeks after the Kurds held a non-binding independence referendum that included the disputed province of Kirkuk. More than 90% of the Kurdish region's residents voted to split from Iraq. The Iraqi federal government, Turkey, Iran, and the U.S. all rejected that independence drive. The multi-ethnic region of Kirkuk lies just outside of the autonomous Kurdish region in Iraq's north. Called the country's oil capital, Kirkuk produces around 500,000 barrels a day. In 2014, amid the ISIS onslaught across northern Iraq, the Kurds took control of Kirkuk as the Iraqi military fled the city. In the 3 years since, the Kurds, led by their president Masoud Barzani, sought to cement their hold despite tensions with the central government. Today, Kurdish officials accused Iraq of carrying out a major multi-pronged attack.
I don't know what's happening exactly because we have been in this fight since 4 in the morning. We have suffered casualties, including martyrs, and now we have withdrawn to this position. Some of the other Kurdish forces have pulled out. They didn't fire a single shot.
While Kurdish forces withdrew from posts south of the city, some residents vowed to die fighting. Thousands of others fled north.
For the last few years, the Iraqi forces, these primarily Shia militia of the Hashid Shabi, and the Kurdish forces have been focused on fighting ISIS. Now that fight is coming to an end, and what the fear is that now these internal divisions in Iraq are going to become more apparent and possibly more violent.
These clashes pit one substantially American-armed military force against another. Both the Kurdish forces and Iraqi government troops are part of the coalition fighting ISIS. The U.S. sought to downplay the fighting, labeling the exchange of gunfire a misunderstanding. And in the Rose Garden, President Trump tried to stay neutral.
We don't like the fact that they're clashing. We're not taking sides, but we don't like the fact that they're clashing.
The first issue is a part of a larger conflict over autonomy and control over the future of Iraq as a state. And as we discussed here, there's a fundamental difference that's at the root of this conflict between the preferences of the Kurdish nationalists, and not all Kurds agree on this, who want an independent Kurdistan, and Iraqi nationalists who want a united Iraq that includes Kurdistan. And whether Iraq's future is one of a federation in which there's different regions with some autonomy or some status but are all part of a united Iraq, or something more like a confederation in which there's semi-autonomous or fully independent regions that have a loose association with each other, will need to be worked out in whatever settlement comes after these conflicts after they drive out ISIS. And what the Kurds did in initiating this referendum was to press their preferences at a relatively early stage by holding this referendum 3 weeks ago. And from the United States perspective, this was unfortunate because it invited conflict between two of its main allies in the ongoing fight against ISIS. And what it showcases here, and this is really important to note, is that the military defeat of ISIS and taking back all or most of the territory that ISIS once occupied in Iraq and Syria will not necessarily be the end of conflict in this region. Defeating ISIS on the military battlefield is fast becoming a reality. And there was news that broke this morning, and we'll probably talk about it in the future in the news segments, of the fall of Raqqa, the de facto capital of ISIS, in which American-backed forces are defeating and driving out ISIS from its capital. And so Kurdish forces were also part of this collection of local fighters that are driving out ISIS from Raqqa, and thus these multiple actors within all of these regional fighters that are battling ISIS under the coalition led by the United States will complicate this settlement. So we're going to discuss this complicated alliance dynamics, particularly in Syria, in later news segments more thoroughly, perhaps as early as next week, as the news develops with this battle over Raqqa. Now, the second point to to make here is the move by Kurds in holding a referendum for independence has region-wide consequences, and thus provoked resistance from other actors outside of Iraq. Both Iran and Turkey have strong incentives to prevent Kurdish independence, since each of these countries have a relatively large Kurdish minority population, and these Kurds have expressed a desire for autonomy and independence, particularly in Turkey. And so just, again, you can see the connections between our news story last week, just as in Europe, when France and Germany stood with Spain against Catalonia's independence referendum out of self-interest to deter their own potential challenges to state sovereignty, so has Iran and Turkey acted to prevent Kurds from striving for independence in Iraq, so that Kurds in Turkey and Iran do not try to emulate their actions and demand independence as well. And so for the United States, and this third point is that then this adds additional complications for the United States. And so, thirdly, the United States has tried to stay out of the emerging battle and not really pick sides between its two allies. It doesn't really want to intervene and pick a winner here, but it's trying its best as might. But the United States has already tried to prevent this referendum, to keep the Kurds from initiating it by offering to broker negotiations about the status of Kurdistan in Iraq between the Kurds and the Iraqi national government. And according to reports, the Kurdish leadership wanted a guarantee of ultimate independence brokered by the United States at the end of such negotiations, and the United States did not and could not really provide that. And so, arguably, the United States has interest in keeping Iraq united as one state, perhaps with some autonomy for Kurds to work out a deal, but not full independence, in order to manage this complicated alliance dynamics and settlement that will come in a post-ISIS Middle East. Because if the Kurds achieve independence in Iraq, the United States will have not only a problem with the Iraqi state, which will be a big problem for them, but also with Turkey. And fourth, what was even more provocative about this referendum itself was that the independence vote by the Kurds included the disputed territory of the city of Kirkuk and its surrounding region, which is an important oil-producing region that we've already discussed. But Kirkuk is not part of Kurdistan proper, and thus Iraq has claimed direct jurisdiction over it. By holding the Kurdish independence referendum in Kirkuk, as well as Kurdistan, Kurdish leadership was signaling its intention to retain some level of territorial control over that vital oil-producing region. And that's where the main catalyst was for a move by the Iraqi government to start taking that territory back and maintaining its control. Kirkuk is interesting, too, is unique because it's not a Kurdish region. I mean, it's multi-ethnic, and a majority, it doesn't have a majority of Kurds in that region, but rather a collection of Arabs, Kurds, and Turkmen in the region. And so we'll be continuing to watch this, but that's the situation in Iraq, and they'll face a similar sort of dilemma when they drive ISIS, as they have been, out of Syria as well. In the dynamics there between the various actors is even more complicated. And so we'll return to that later.